This interview of George Zier of Dayton, Washington is being done for the Video History of Columbia County section of the Dayton Historical Depot Society. The interviewer is Dick Juris, photographer Mike Floyd. We are taping this interview with George Zier because he was one of the early pioneers of canning process in Dayton, Washington. These introductory pictures are being made of the Pillsbury Green Giant facility in Dayton because this is where George spent most of his working life. This is the office facility of the cannery, with the cannery proper appearing in the background.
We're up in the upstairs of the Dayton Depot, and we're going to interview George Zier today. And it's a fine day, 32 degrees out there, but this is better being inside than out. George, I would like you to state your full name and where you were born and your birthday.
Okay, my name is George Zier, and I was born at Odessa, Washington. That's 110 miles north of Dayton in year 1917. Born on a dry land wheat farm where the succession of crops are on a summer fallow basis, and where the annual rainfall is something like 6 to 10 inches. So it's quite a different country than what we have here at Dayton.
Well, yes, I should say. Well, did you want to say, George, a little bit about, or do you know any of the history of your folks coming to get there?
Okay, my folks are of German descent, and they had migrated out of Germany into Russia when Catherine the Great was the wife of the Tsar, and they spent some time in Russia, but left when they were being conscripted to work to serve in the Tsar's army. So they migrated to the United States and originally settled at Walla Walla, and then moved up north of the Columbia and Snake Rivers to Odessa.
Very interesting.
So they actually moved into that country when it was still unbroken fields of bunchgrass and ryegrass and sagebrush.
Well, how did they travel across the country to get to Odessa? Did they?
By the old wagon train.
Did that start out from somewhere in Missouri or someplace like that?
I think they started somewhat in Kansas.
Oh, I'll be there. Well, that's very interesting. Well, that's great. Well, George, when you were a young lad, you went to school in Odessa?
My first 3 years were in the country school, and at that time it was just the beginning of consolidation of the rural schools to go to the towns, and we were bused to the town. And so I spent my succeeding 9 years in the school system at Odessa. Graduated there in 1935, and at that time that was during the period of the Great Depression, so there wasn't any money to go to college, so I spent one more year going back and took a postgraduate course and took subjects of typing, shorthand, bookkeeping to prepare myself for maybe a little business career.
And you could take those courses in the high school? Right?
Yes, at that time I was taking in high school, and it was just extra credits, or if I hadn't decided to go into college.
Well, what kind of jobs, or what did you do as a young lad to make any money to have a good time with, or whatever, buy presents or something?
Well, at that time, there wasn't much of a thing as money during the Depression years, which was primarily 1930 through about 1935, and lived on the farm, as I mentioned. And in order to really exist, because the wheat crops averaged from 10 to 20 bushels per acre, and the price was like 37 to 50 cents per bushel. But we raised a garden that covered about 3 acres, and all the vegetables we needed for the winter. And we had our own cows and chickens and hogs, and so virtually we were self-sufficient. which is not the situation in many farms today because they've become so to one product type of thing.
That's right. Well, that's interesting. Well, now, when you got through high school, what was your next step? Where did you go, or what did you do?
Okay, as I mentioned, I took 1 year of postgraduate work, and then from the crop of potatoes that we sold, $250 worth, and that's put me to business college in Spokane.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I spent about a year in business college, and then in 1937, June of that year, when I graduated, my first job was here in Dayton, and that's where I've remained ever since.
Well, there. Now, you hadn't gotten married yet.
No, I wasn't married until 1939. I spent two years and worked down here before I became married.
Well, when you say you got your first job down here, what was the...
Okay, my first job was doing payroll work for the Washington Idaho Seed Company. The Washington Idaho Seed Company was the contract grower of all of the green peas for what was now, at that time, called Blue Mountain Canneries. They were a separate corporation, and they grew the green peas for the cannery, and aside from that, they grew seed peas, which they sold to the cannery here and to all the canneries in the Midwest.
Was the seed company established here?
Yes, the seed company was here before the cannery actually started, because they had been raising seed peas. In fact, they hand harvested green peas, a test run the year before the cannery came here, and that was canned all along.
I didn't know that. And that was what,
1933 or 34, because I think 34 is when the cannery started, 35.
Well, what motivated the cannery people to come out here? Did they come from...
Well, what started the interest in this area was, of course, the fact that this gentleman who owned the Washington Seed Company was aware of the area and its potential for growing peas, and he had contacts with American Canning Company back in the Midwest, and they were looking for additional sources of supplying their manufactured cans, and so they looked into the area and they sent out one of their employees, who happened to be Mr. A.D. Radeball, who became the first president of the Blue Mountain Canneries, and he was sent out here to get the operation started, and that's how it started, strictly on an idea to sell cans.
Oh, that's great. Oh, was the home office of some of these canneries back in the Midwest or back east somewhere? Or?
Okay, now the Blue Mountain Canneries was a separate corporation at that time, and later it became affiliated with Central Minnesota Valley Canning Company. And he became an officer in Minnesota Valley Canning Company, and then in a few short years, why they merged with the Minnesota Valley Canning Company.
I know in front of us here we have some scrapbooks, and maybe you could tell us some about these books, and maybe we could look at some of the pictures in here. Do you know about these books, George?
Oh yes, these books are very familiar because my wife started them and maintained them all the time that she worked up there. And looking at the dates in the books, I see that the first one's newspaper articles and et cetera started in 1935, and they go through 1976. So there's quite a history of newspaper articles and different things in there.
George, if we could go back now to get this a little clearer, and you could state, as you came into the cannery picture here, what was the names of them, and as they progressed down through the present day, maybe you could state various name changes and ownership of the cannery.
Okay, drop back when I entered the picture, it was in the year 1937, in the month of June, and I remember today very vividly my first impression of Dayton, coming from the dry land up there where there are virtually no trees and lots of dust. You come down here and the roadsides were green, the hills were green, and it was right in the summer when the locusts were in full blossom, and it was a fragrance that I'll never forget. So anyway, that was my entry into the canning business, and as I mentioned before, I was working at the Washington Seed Company in the payroll, and they grew the peas for the canning. Now this went on in this manner until 1941, and at that time the Washington Seed Company dropped out of the picture, and the cannery took over the farming operations entirely. So they, at that time, were doing the farming as well as the canning. And in 1939, the cannery also started a preliminary planting of a small acreage of asparagus, which they began to can, and during the succeeding years, this became larger and larger all the time. So they had the two crops, asparagus from April till the end of June, and peas from the 1st of June to the end of July. At that time it was called Blue Mountain Canneries, and sometime in the 50s, why it merged with the Minnesota Valley Canning Company. And then I think it was about the 1960s why they turned the name over to a more sensational thing for the public, I guess you might say, and picked up their brand name called Green Giant. Of course, that kicked off a real good program of advertising. The Jolly Green Giant is ho 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 and everything. And so at that time, the industry began to really boom from a small cannery. Now it was one of the nation's largest producers of asparagus and peas. In the 1960s, the cannery here then also picked up from Bozeman Canning Company additional plants, one at Ellensburg, Washington, one at Waitsburg, Washington, and one at Buell, Idaho. These were primarily corn and pea plants, and the one at Waitsburg, of course, just 10 miles down the road, was more or less worked in conjunction with Dayton's plant management and the people. See, and then the acreage continued to expand year by year. I can't remember the exact year, but in the 1970s we were up to a point where we were raising peas on about 23,000 acres of farm ground in the Columbia County. The sequence of growing peas is much an off year to the growing of wheat, so it worked out really well for the farmers here that they could get out of a straight wheat program and get the land so that it picked up nitrogen and different things that were good for their farming practices. To drop back a little bit, thinking about the farming practices, of course, at first it was all hand labor. We had several thousand, you might say, migrant people during the Depression years that came out here from the Midwest, from the Dust Bowl, and they would come out in the summer to earn a little bit of money, and eventually many of those people actually settled and moved to Dayton and made it their permanent home. Also, the Civilian Conservation Corps had a camp out here, and several of those people that were in that group stayed and worked in the cannery and became citizens and still are living in Dayton.
That was still during the Depression years.
That was during the Depression years, yes. In fact, also during the Depression years, another thing to remember is that the rate of pay for the hand labor was 25 cents an hour, and the farmers, for the use of their farmland to grow the peas on, were paid a minimum of $6 per acre, and they were, at that time, glad to have it. So by contrast to the dollars and figures we think of in these days.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Well, I see, so we were talking a little bit earlier, let's see now, during World War II, were there some other people that...
During World War II, of course, the migrant labor program dried up completely because people went into permanent programs, shipyards, the aircraft industry, and into the service, of course. And at that time, then, we started our programs of bringing Mexican nationals from Mexico and Texas Mexicans from Texas. And at that time, we also built a labor camp out here, which housed several thousand people. In fact, even during the war years, for a short time, we used some Japanese from the internment camps down in Oregon, and there was a small contingent of German prisoners of war that we used for a short time.
Well, when you move past the war years and World War II years, and then the Green Giant was sold in, was it sold again to Pillsbury Company or something?
In the 1970s, Pillsbury Corporation from Minneapolis, Minnesota, through a stock transfer program, merged the Green Giant Company, as it was known at that time, into the Pillsbury Company on a stock option program. And we were still known as Green Giant, but it had an additional name of Green Giant Pillsbury. And in about the year 1980, the green pea operation was dropped completely. And this was, of course, was a disaster to the city of Dayton because the vast summer employment opportunities to the young people here who earned money to go on to college just disappeared like that. Up to that time, why just many of the local boys and girls went to college through their summer learnings that they derived at the academy or out in the field.
Do you recall, George, what the reason was to terminate the pea industry?
That was a combination of things. The food desires of the American public was changing. They were going to more into frozen products. And although we had attempted to freeze peas at Wadesburg, and it was a good product, but we were sitting here at a disadvantageous position due to freight. The big market is back in the east and to California and more to the southeast. And so everything we had to meet the competition of Midwest pea growers as far as freight rates are concerned, and it was just more than we could manage. At that time, too, the labor rates in the state of Washington were advancing a little faster than the Midwest was, and also the costs of farming, the farm rental program was getting higher because the wheat program here was getting a little more lucrative to the growers with the new wheat varieties they had and the high moisture, why they could make a little more money growing wheat than they could and other crops than they could peas. So it just was a combination of about 4 or 5 factors that brought the end to the pea industry here.
Now, let's see, is it still under Pillsbury, or it was one at that time, I guess, it was one of the largest companies in the United States.
And that's in 1980 when Pillsbury took it over. Why then, of course, we were the largest food processing organization in the United States. And in the year 1989, in January of 1989, a company from Great Britain known as Grand Met made a buyout offer, which was not a stock transfer offer, but just a plain buyout. They'll buy you for X number of dollars per share. And this was much going on. Much of this was going on in the business world at that time of mergers and buyouts. And so at that time, we lost our identity as a American corporation and belonged to the Grand Met of Great Britain. Of course, locally, it doesn't mean anything to the people here because these are all people who were producing something. It's just the people who were at the higher echelons of vice presidents and managers and directors that felt the blow of that takeover.
Well, that's a real history and a lot of change in a period of, what, I don't know, about, 40, 50 years, maybe something like that?
Well, from 1934 to 1989, that's
Tremendous change
50 years.
into a worldwide operation now, from a little thing that started down in Dayton. So that's really something. Well, while we were talking about this, of course, all these things couldn't have happened without people, and so I noticed that you have some scrapbooks here, and maybe you could say something about the scrapbooks, and we could talk about that for a while.
Yes, it was real good to start with a company in its infancy because it was small and it was just like a family. And the president of the company was more like a fellow that you sit down to and chat with and do anything with. You know, it isn't like the difference between employees and managers as you see in big corporations today. So every year, of course, and then they would have an annual party or program, you might say, which would be a combination of giving service awards for years of service and for people who were retiring. And the Academy had a real good program of retirement for its employees. in retirement payments and in health benefits. And of course, every year, this program would go on, and during the year, as people came to the organization or left and went to the headquarters in Minnesota, the local paper made good use of their time in writing articles and taking pictures and keeping track of what was going on. And during that period of time, my wife was employed as secretary to the manager, and she started cataloging these articles and pictures. So,
well, George, before you open that up, I want to ask you about, we missed when you got married. Now, when did that happen?
All right, I was in Dayton for 2 years, 1937 to 1939. I finally persuaded my childhood sweetheart from high school to marry me. She was working for the Spokesman View in Spokane. And so we were married in October of 1939.
Was she employed by Green Giant?
Well, at first, she wasn't employed at all at first, and her first employment came with the ASCS office.
Oh, I see.
And she worked with them for a while, and then when the war started and the people became of short supply, the cannery was losing quite a few people, and Mr. Winkle asked her if she would come to work for the cannery. So she started working for the cannery in 1942. And worked there all the time until she retired.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, okay, we're talking about people now. Maybe some of the pictures.
Yeah, the people is certainly what makes the organization. And look at this one scrapbook here. This first picture that's in the front here is a picture of the labor camp at which the seasonal employees were housed and fed.
Now, were these? Let's see, you said there was the prisoners of war, and then there were people that came from the Dust Bowl country. Now, was this built at that time?
This was not built at that time. The people that came from the Dust Bowl companies were sort of on their own. In other words, they lived in tents down on the riverbank and wherever they could find some place to sleep. And this was built when we started having the Mexicans transferred in here because the government wouldn't allow, unless you had facilities. And so this is one of the first labor camps that was built under the program of migrant workers out of Mexico.
Oh, I see. Is this still in use today?
It is still in use today for the asparagus program, where the people that work in the asparagus factory operation still live in these quarters.
Well, that's interesting. Very nice facility.
It's been maintained and renovated many times, but it's still operating.
Do we have any other pictures in there?
Let's see. We're talking about people.
Oh, yeah.
And this is just happened, one that was in the front here, at one of the awards parties. And of course, the Jolly Green Giant had to be the prominent figure wherever we were. And just looking at the people here, why I can still, this, wish there were a date on it, but...
Yeah, let's see if they're on the back. Right here.
Here it is, 1955 awards party. All right. This is Mary Booker. She was the wife of the plant superintendent. This is Mrs. Vern Dudley, and here's her husband Vern. He was the vice president of the cannery, of the farming operations here. And this is Mr. Radeball and Mrs. Radeball. He was the president. That's his wife. And this is Walt Bachtold, who was the assistant to the controller. The controller isn't in this picture, but that just happened to be the first part of that line. And at every one of the parties, there were pictures like this taken, and the scrapbook is just full of them.
Did you have a couple in the scrapbook here, George? I don't know. Are there any areas?
Probably is if we could find them.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things there, isn't there? Now, this scrapbook started when the cannery, way back about when it was
Yes,
under
the first articles in here are dated 1934.
34.
That's when they were first. I just opened up to this here. This is the date of 1957. 257 Mexican nationals hit Dayton. he received Reserve Award from the Navy. And here's a picture of some of the officers of the Minnesota Valley Cannon Company. It was still called at that time. This was the president, Ward Cosgrove, and the vice president, Bill Dietrich. And this was Vern Dudley, our local manager here, and Frank Booker, who was the plant superintendent here. And you can just page any place through here and run into pictures that were, again, of people. Here's a picture of one of our local fellows, Frank Jackson, and two fellows that were retired. Arvid Anderson, who grew up here and became president of Green Giant of Canada. There again is Mr. Dudley, and this is another fellow from Minnesota who became the president after succeeding several of the other fellows there. It's kind of every 3-4 years why they retire and have a new president.
Yeah, that's very, well, there's a lot of history in there, George. Well, you know, one of the things that I don't know, it'd be nice if we had an aerial shot, but I don't think we do have one.
Well, let's see if you can turn that off a minute.
Okay, what's this the shot of now, George?
This is a shot of the original cannery facility, which was built back in 1934 in the sum total of 45 days from the time they started until it was ready for operation. Nowadays, it takes you 45 days just to get a permit.
Do you have any idea what the cost was at that time?
I think about $140,000.
Well, isn't that that's remarkable. Well, that's interesting. Maybe we ought to talk, George, a little bit about the machinery when they started out. I know what was it all mechanized like it is today, or the field operation, for instance?
Well, the machinery went through a sequence of mechanization similar to what happened to the wheat farmer. Back in 1934, we were just going from horse and mules to tractors. In fact, I remember when I came in 1937, there was still a farmer in the mountain here, Johnson Brothers. They still farmed with mules, but most of it had converted to tractor. Now, as far as the peas concerned, there was very little mechanization in the peas. They were cut down with a mower, what we called a swather, and the first ones were of the old type where either team horses would push it or a tractor would push the header. It's just a simple header that would cut it into and put it into a windrow. And from these windrows, by then flatbed trucks would come along, and there'd be 3-4 people with good old pitchfork. And just throw it onto the truck.
I wonder if, let's see, Mike Floyd, who's running the camera, what you had a story to tell about that, Mike? What was it?
Well, I could say that, except for working in the apples, thinning apples and moving ladders for the ladies, that I think the first person I ever applied to for a job was George Zier. And I think this had to be along in 1936, about the time, or 37, the time I was a freshman or a sophomore in high school. And it was really my ambition to get out there and get a job in the field, because they were paying pretty good money in those days. I think George mentioned 25 cents an hour, and that's better than 15 cents I was making thinning apples. But yes, and our football coach encouraged us not to get a job driving a truck. He wanted us to build ourselves physically, so naturally I got the job of pitching peas onto the truck. The only thing job worse than that out there was pitching from the piles into the binder, because there you could never quit. At least pitching onto the truck, you're assigned to one truck, and you hope that when you got to the binder to dump his load, that there were a bunch of trucks lined up, and he had to wait quite a while before you get back. But yeah, I thank George for
George
probably had the first job, but he just got through saying a while ago that anybody that showed up would be given a pitchfork, so I just didn't take any brains to work out in the pea fields.
Yeah, recruitment was an unknown commodity in those days. The people were just available, and you took, like, I'll take you, and you.
They were looking for work.
I can recall back in those days, George, that the cannery had to do a lot of nationwide recruiting. I can't believe that all the college students that showed up around here wanting work were just word of mouth. But I know every year, I mean, the girls look forward to all these college students showing up around here working the peas.
Well, how did that happen, George? Did they have a program talking to these college kids?
No, really, it was just a word of mouth. You know, everybody was looking for a chance to make a little money to go to school. There were no loans, no grants, no loans from the government back in those days, and so they were on their own. And the word got around pretty fast. You know, here's a place we can go and earn a little money.
Well, that's great. Now, when we go back kind of to this thing that I think Mike mentioned that the vines were taken by truck to the viners, and in those days that they didn't have combines, I guess, did they?
Oh, that's right. The viners were a stationary contraption which the peas were hauled to the front and then dumped. And then they had what they called spike pitchers at that location who would pitch the peas from the piles into the viner. And as Mike said, that was even tougher because by that time they would come all tangled up and there was always a supply in front of them. It wasn't that once in a while you'd get a little rest. And this machine, through a system of rotary boards inside of a drum, would crush the peas out of the pod. The peas would fall down into the sides into boxes. And when the boxes were full, they'd be loaded on another flatbed truck and hauled to the town to be canned.
Well, that's interesting.
Didn't the cannery have some kind of a motto back in those days, like an hour from the field to the can or something like this? I know they moved it pretty fast, but...
They probably would spoil. How long could you leave them out before they had to get into the cannery?
Well, they didn't like to leave them out too long. I can't remember the exact time, but Mike is right. It's just a matter of hours and they should be in and being processed. Otherwise, they get tough and you lose your quality.
Yeah, well, that's pretty important.
So then, as mechanization became a little better in the farming community, then eventually the viner was put onto a chassis and powered with a motor and self-propelled, similar as the self-propelled combine is today. And swathers would go ahead of them and move the peas down into a windrow, and the combine would come behind and with a pickup attachment would just pick them up, and instead of having to hand hitching in, they would pick them up and go through the machine and do the same job that the old contraption did in an identical way, but in a nice, easy manner with very little labor.
Well, that's true.
Hand labor, I mean.
Yes. Well, I think now what the latest combine in this area they don't even use a swather, I guess.
No, I think the latest, the picker just picks the pods off of the vines and takes the pods into the machine and leaves the remnant of the vines on the ground.
So there's been tremendous change, not only in people but in equipment and the different kind of people that you're required now to have in the field work. What happened in the canning process? I think you said somewhere back there the diets changed, and so there had to be changes, I suppose, within the plant as it moved along.
Yes, and that certainly affected the whole industry. At one time, from Pendleton, Oregon to Lewiston, Idaho, there were a total of 11 pea canneries.
Oh.
And to this date, there's probably 2 left out of that group of 11, which all goes back to that same situation of less canned peas required and not being able to keep up with the competition from the Midwest. And the people's diets have changed a lot. There's so much now, in the restaurant. The old standby was you get peas or you get corn. Now you get broccoli and cauliflower and a lot of sauteed type of vegetables. It's just a different diet.
Well, have they gone into the freezing more, the can, or they still?
Well, even in the restaurants, they use a lot of canned, frozen product rather than canned. Yes.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know whether they raise. I know they raise broccoli and some of those things down in Mexico quite a bit to bring up into this country now. And I don't know if that's true with peas or not. Do you know anything about that?
Well, California is probably the biggest state for the cool crops, broccoli, cauliflower at that time.
Well, what did in the process of this cannery, here and evolved through the different ownerships and so on. Did you guys conduct research, or where'd you get your up-to-date pea seed and so on?
Oh yes, the cannery here had its own research department. The nephew of Mr. Radebaugh, Garnet Radebaugh, was in charge of development of pea varieties, and they had pea trial plots in several locations around the county, and they carried on a very intensive program of pea research and developing new varieties.
Well, that's interesting. Now I kind of wonder, George, we were talking about finally the cannery stopped the raising of peas in this area, and it was a real economic blow to the community, I think. And of course, the mechanization changed that. What future do you see now that we still have a green giant cannery here in Dayton, and the peas are no longer processed here? What do they use the plant for now?
But the equipment for the peas, of course, also part of the problem was that it was becoming obsolete in any industry. If you don't keep up to date, why, pretty soon you're out of business. So what we have now is asparagus, and they've been very good at updating their equipment every couple of years. In fact, they are the elite asparagus plant in the United States. From this one plant alone, virtually 50% of the national product of asparagus is produced. So it's a rather fantastic figure.
Well, where is this asparagus growing? I don't think they grow much in Columbia County anymore.
The acreage in Columbia County was very limited because the only place we could grow it was in the valleys. And once asparagus had been grown on this ground, we found out that it couldn't be replanted back to asparagus because it just wouldn't produce a quantity of asparagus that was feasible. And so we moved the operation into the Columbia Basin. And of course, the Columbia Basin came under the reclamation project from the Grand Coulee Dam, and that whole area of millions of acres are being farmed there. And asparagus is one of the big crops, hay, and many other things. But I think the asparagus that they are harvesting as of this last year came from as far as Umatilla, Oregon, and over as far as Yakima, Washington, and that whole area, and including the Columbia Basin and through there, is where the asparagus supply comes from individual farmers. Instead of having a few large farms as we had originally, these are all small growers from 5 to 20, 30, 40 acres, and they have just several hundreds of growers that they work with now. So that big farming operation of Mexicans coming in here to cut asparagus was curtailed and stopped about 5, 6 years ago, I would say, about 1985. The regulations from the government became so costly in what you had to supply for them for housing, for insurance, transportation, and guarantees that it became too costly to continue to do our own farming. And so at that time, why the county went to all the various growers and to the farmers that where the asparagus wasn't being grown and said, well, we're going to have to change our operation. It's up to you now. And so all these small farmers have, in one way or another, been able to recruit their own people. And it's a tough goal, but the amount of asparagus we're getting now is like 10, 20 times as much as it was just a few years ago.
Well, George, I don't know if you want to stick your neck out, but would you like to make a prediction of how the future is for, say, the green giant in Dayton and the asparagus business, or do you think there's a future here for quite a while or not?
Well, I sure hope there is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people still depending upon this.
Now, you spent practically your whole working, how long did you work for Green Giant?
My entire career, I worked for this one facility here in Dayton. I started here and I retired here. It was about 42 years.
And you enjoyed it? I presume it sounded like you did.
Oh yes, I was invited many times to go back to the headquarters office in Minnesota, but I made enough trips back there every spring working on the audit programs that I saw enough of the type of operation you have at the higher levels in a big corporation. It just wasn't my thought of living.
Well, now, since you retired, when did you retire now?
I retired actually in 1978. I've been retired 12 years now.
Well, what have you been doing since?
Well, having grown up on the farm and walked over many, many acres of summer fowl hoeing weeds, I've become allergic to sunlight. So the summer I spend over on the Olympic Peninsula where there's lots of nice fir trees and you don't get in the sun. It stays about 75, 80 degrees instead of 100 and 105 degrees. So then I come back to Dayton in the wintertime so I can enjoy the winter weather and the snow.
When you say snow, do you like to ski?
Well, I like to take a good swing at it.
Yeah, well, I know that. I asked that question because I meet you up there occasionally. Well, Mike, if you've got any other questions, I'm sure we've left out all kinds of things we'll think about later, but okay. Well, we thank you very much, George, and I hope we haven't missed a lot of things. And if we have, we'll come back and add some more to it. Thank you very much.
Well, I thank you, and I think this is a fine project you fellows are involved in.
Well,